Welcome. On behalf of the Center for International Studies, I'm John Tierman, the Executive Director, and I'm happy to welcome you and our speaker today. Marc Sageman is known to most of you as a leading researcher and expert on terrorism. He is now, in addition to many, many activities, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and author of many things on this topic, most recently Leaderless Jihad, Terror Networks in the 21st Century, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. As you probably know, Marc has consulted very broadly to the U.S. government and others on issues pertaining to his research. He's an MD and PhD in sociology, which is an unusual combination in my experience, and makes him particularly well suited for some of this research. He has worked for the U.S. Navy, for the CIA. He spent time in Afghanistan during the resistance to Soviet occupation. Well, not in Afghanistan, in Pakistan during the resistance to the occupation of Afghanistan. Since 1994, he's been in private practice of forensic and clinical psychiatry and has, of course, taken up this very insightful interest in research on terror networks. And that is what he will address today. So please help me welcome Marc Sageman.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. All right. Since I only have half an hour, I'm not going to give you a lot of the fluff and background. Let me go right into the subject matter. Basically, there is no secret about studying terrorism. It's all about methodology. And, you know, when I try to teach, I just try to teach a methodology because it turns out I think that one terrorism organization is very different from another one. So here, basically, I was trying to apply, coming from medicine, the scientific method as we do in medicine to terrorism studies. And the key here is to really build a database. Most of the database that existed when I started were useless because they were incident-based databases. So you have to build a terrorist database as opposed to incidents. The data is really very ambiguous. There's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of misinformation. So the best way to do this is really to start from the trials. You take trial transcripts. It's two narratives that's challenged by either side. Captured documents. Some investigative journalism is pretty good, but from the trial transcript, you have to go to the field and do your own investigation. And if you remember, ask me what I've learned the last 6 months, because I knew more about terrorism with greater conviction 6 months ago than I do now. And I'll tell you why. You know, I'm a parochial American, so the people I wanted to study were basically the guys who came after us. So I started from the 9/11 guys, the 19 guys who did 9/11. That was my index sample, and I grew the sample out to whoever had an operational relationship with them. And I have now about 500 not complete biographies in some of them, extremely complete, but fragments, you know, to test the conventional wisdom. Since not all of them were operationally related to 9/11, after a while I kind of understood what they had in common. And basically what they had in common is that they used violence against the far enemy, namely the non-Muslim governments and population in furtherance of an Islamist agenda, creating an Islamist state in the Middle East. This ideology, the politics evolved over time, but basically, in a nutshell, it's a violent Islamist born-again social movement it's composed, I will tell you, I mean, that's what I've learned, of basically young men, and as any young man, well, some women now more commonly, but young men who are seeking thrills, seeking glory especially, and a greater sense of purpose and group belonging. Let me give you a little bit the evolution of the threat. The problem. Okay. Can you hear? Okay. All right. Something statically is that sometimes you realize you're wrong. And so when I wrote my first book, and I'm going to show data from the first book, I kind of closed the collection of data in December 2003, is that it was completely the opposite of what I've seen after I published my book. It's as if the bad guys read my book and said, ha, we'll show him, and we'll do the opposite. And so, here we're stuck. If you pull all the data together, you don't realize how the data evolves over time. And it dawned on me after rereading Rappaport's great piece on the 4 waves of terror, throughout the last century and a half, that's exactly what we were dealing with. We're dealing, in a sense, analytically with 3 different waves. The first one, other people basically joined this movement at its inception. Those were basically the comrades in arms of Osama bin Laden. They called the Afghan Arabs, upper middle class, lots of physicians, engineers, well-educated, mostly Egyptian, about 30 at the age of joining, fairly religious actually. But because they were militants or terrorists, they couldn't really go home, so they stuck around. And the more militant of them basically organized themselves into this new organization, the base, Al-Qaeda, in late August 1988. They stuck around Peshawar for a while, and other governments were complaining to the Pakistanis that they were harboring terrorists, so the Pakistanis kicked them out. At the same time, Hassan al-Turabi of the Sudan, who was basically the power behind the throne, invited them. And from 92 to 96, Khartoum was basically the capital of terrorism, of Islamic terrorism. There you had Hezbollah. I mean, Turabi, even though he's a Sunni, basically invited everybody. And there they exchange ideas, they exchange strategies, they exchange tactics. And also during that period of time between 92 and 96, this is where the debate between the near enemy and the far enemy took place. Let me remind you quickly, the near enemy is basically their own government. Those guys want to overthrow their own government, and they realized that they had been unsuccessful in doing that after a quarter of a century of trying. And so the question is, how come they failed? I'm still going in and out here. Yeah. But okay. And some of them, a very small minority, argued that the reason they had failed to overthrow the government is that the far enemy, the West, was propping up their own government. And so they suggested that they should switch strategy, and instead of going directly against their own government, they should kick the West out of the Middle East first. And so the guys that I'm looking at are the guys who were following this strategy. Most people rejected it at the time. And when the Sudan turned on them in 1996, when they kicked them out, there were about 150 of them who espoused this strategy and who went back to Afghanistan.